Hi there! In this video, I'm going to make an easy artisan sourdough bread. It is the most popular recipe on my website in Oregon Cottage, and it has hundreds of comments, 5-star reviews, and comments and questions. And I thought I would make it for you today and kind of answer the questions as we go along. This is a great beginner sourdough, so once you've started your created your starter and you're in the first few weeks of it and you're ready to make bread, this is the great recipe because it's simple, it uses cups and measurements, and very easy to follow. So when you're making any kind of sourdough bread or product, you need to start with your sourdough starter. And this sourdough starter has been fed the night before. This is a very active, I've had this sourdough starter now for probably 3 years, so and I had one before that for longer than that, so they can last for many years. And on my website I also have sourdough tips and tricks and how to keep your sourdough in the refrigerator. So if you need more information of that, we'll link that in the description below. So I really like to feed the sourdough for this bread, the starter, the night before, so that I can get started with the bread in the morning, and it has all day to do its rise, and then we can cook it and have it cool enough so we can have it for dinner. So I love having fresh warm bread for dinner. So that's key. So this starter was fed the night before. It was at a 1 cup measure when I fed it, and now it's above 2, and it's active and bubbly, so you know that it's ready to go. Okay, so the first thing we do is, well, basically we put all the ingredients in a bowl. When you're using your starter after it's doubled, you want to stir it down just a little bit, and then go ahead and measure out your 3/4 cup of starter for the recipe. And I just use a regular, dry cup measure. I also have used a wet. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter if you get another teaspoon or tablespoon or something of starter in there. You can adjust your flour and water later on. And I think that's one of the biggest questions I get about this recipe is that it's a really wet dough, but also everybody's starter is different. And my starter, I keep it a little bit more on the thick side. It's also 100% whole wheat starter. So because of those things, it acts a little bit differently with whatever flour I put in there. And your starter, if it's with all-purpose flour, or you keep it at 100% hydration, whereas mine is a little bit less at between 75 and 80% hydration, I find that it grows better with whole wheat if I use a little more flour and less water, which gives it the lower hydration. It will act differently. So you kind of have to keep working at it. Like, a lot of people have success first time on this recipe, and I am so excited about that. But if you don't give up, because you just need to learn to feel what your starter looks like, what the flour you're working with looks like. Whole wheat absorbs a lot more water than all-purpose, and those are the kind of things that you just kind of have to experiment and play around. I will say that even when the recipe doesn't rise as much as you want, it's a beautiful loaf. It tastes wonderful, and you will enjoy it no matter how it turns out. So anyway, let's put the starter in, and it's a very simple recipe. You use flour, water, starter, salt, and honey. Put the honey in for just a little bit more sugar to give the yeast something to eat, and also it kind of colors the bread. But if you want to leave out the honey, leave it out, it's fine. If you want to replace it with regular sugar, you can do that. So a lot of people ask how I measure my cups of flour, and I do a scoop and level. Scoop and level. I'm using an artisan bread flour today. I use all different kinds. I've used whole wheat. It's a denser loaf with not as many air holes in it with whole wheat, but it's good, and I really like that too. I've used all-purpose flour, and again, I usually have to use a little bit more flour for that. And scoop and level, and so we put 3 cups in there to start with, and we'll keep our flour here because we're probably going to have to add some more as we're kneading. The other thing is water. You want 1.25 cups of water. I think I have on the recipe, you can adjust that if you want, depending on if your starter is pretty wet. And if you find that that's kind of too much and you have to add too much flour, the one thing I will say about if you can learn to work with a wetter dough, that's how you get those big bubbles inside bread. So if you like the big bubbles, sometimes I don't like as much of that because you can't spread anything on it without it falling through, but some people really like that. So if you like the big bubbles, you want to get used to working with a wetter dough. So that's the kind of a challenge with that. And then salt. I know a lot of people wait to put the salt in until the water and the flour have absorbed after the 15-minute sit, but I tried both ways and I didn't really notice any difference. And I would forget the salt sometimes. So I just put it all in at once. Okay, so you just want to stir until, like I said, it's kind of a shaggy dough, but all of the flour you don't see any big pieces of flour. And now we're going to let this set for 15 minutes for the water and flour to absorb, and it gets all kind of, it's called an autolyse. It just kind of comes together. So we'll meet back in 15 minutes. All right, so now your dough has sat for about 15 minutes to allow the flour to absorb the water, and we need to knead it for 5 minutes. I use my KitchenAid for kneading breads. It can be hand kneaded. Again, it's a very wet dough, so you'll have to be careful to not add too much flour to it when you're hand kneading it. So we're going to knead it for 5 minutes, and if you're hand kneading it, it would go 6 to 7 minutes. You'll see that it will start sticking to the sides, and you add a little flour. I put maybe a 1/4 cup in my cup measure, and I just add a little bit at a time, maybe a couple of teaspoons to a tablespoon around the edge of the time, just the whole time that it's kneading. You'll notice as you're kneading, it will then absorb the flour and stick again. So you just kind of want to get it so that the kneading is allowing the gluten to form. And so just help it out as much as you can. Okay, so it's kneaded for about 5 minutes. I've added about a little more than a 1/4 cup of flour to this batch, and I can see that it looks pretty wet to me still, not really like it's supposed to. And a way that I tell that is I touch the dough with my finger, and if it sticks to it, then I know it needs more flour. So the dough should be tacky, but when you pull your finger off, there shouldn't be dough stuck to it. So that's kind of the definition of tacky versus not. So I need to knead this a little bit more and add a little more flour. Okay, so now that the dough is tacky but not sticky, we're going to put it in an oiled bowl. So I just put a little bit of olive oil in the bottom of a kind of a medium-sized bowl, and you're going to scrape the dough. And again, you need to scrape it. If it rolls out, there's too much flour in there. So you scrape the dough into your bowl. And I'm just going to turn the dough once it's in there just to coat it with the oil. And we're going to leave this to set. So it's still pretty sticky, but that means you're going to have those good air bubbles in it. There we go. Okay, and so we've got it's turned and the oil tops on the top, and I'm going to cover it. You can use plastic wrap. If you're going to use a towel, dampen it first because it can still cause it to dry out. I use these reusable, people call them shower caps, but they're just plastic covers. And I've literally had these for probably 6 years, so they really do last a long time. And I just put that over the top, and I'm going to let it set for 3 hours. But during that time, we're going to do 2 turn and fold techniques. So I'm going to set a timer for an hour, and then we'll come back here and I'll show you how I turn and fold it. Okay, so our dough has risen 3 hours and we've turned and folded it 1 to 2 times. So I've actually done this 1 time. and it's nice and fluffy. You can see it's a little bit risen, so the yeast is already working. So now we're going to actually, we're going to oil your hands because you want them to be nice and oily. And you're going to lift the dough again, and instead of just turning it, you're actually going to take it all the way out of the bowl, if you can. It's just to get it really good and turned. And then you're going to put it back in the bowl. Then I just put a little more oil in there because that kind of stuck down in there. And you're going to put it back in the bowl for another 2 hours. So seam side up, back in the bowl, another 2 hours. And we're going to cover it again and let it set. And we will then come back to shape it and bake it. Okay, so we've had our second rise of 2 hours, and I did want to mention that if sometimes your starter is ready at different times and you don't have all day to do it, and if that's the case, you can put the second rise in the refrigerator for overnight. It just slows down the rise, and then in the morning you can continue with the shaping and the rise that we're going to do now. So that is an option to put it in the refrigerator. Some readers have had a lot of success with that. I find that my bread doesn't rise quite as much after being in the refrigerator, but it's totally up to you. It's an option. Okay, now is the time when you really want to flour the dough and flour your hands. And you want to be as gentle as you can with the dough because it's got this wonderful air in it, but it is, you can see it's a wet dough. And then you want to try to get some tension. So in shaping it, you want to provide tension like this. So just shape it, put some flour on top, and continue just going around and around like that, so that you can see that it's getting smoother. It's getting more in the shape that you want. And then you want to move it to your piece of parchment. So you've got a piece of parchment here set in your pan. You can set it on a cookie sheet or a skillet like this. And then you want to take a lot of flour, really heavily flour the top, because this will help when you slash it later. And then I kind of take my fingers around the edge and just continue to shape it. Hold the parchment away and just continue to shape it so that it kind of is encouraged to hold its shape a little bit more. Okay, so that's going to set now for 40 minutes while we heat our enamel pot in the oven. So this is a cast iron enamel pot. I've also used just a plain cast iron Dutch oven. They both work fine. One of my biggest questions, we're going to turn the oven to 450. One of the most often asked questions on my website about the enamel is, can you make this without using an enamel pot? And the answer is yes. Use a, I'm going to put that in there so it can start heating up for us. Use a, like a cookie sheet, or if you have a stone, a baking stone, you can use that. If you have any kind of big lid that fits on top of that, you can put that over the top. What you want to do is try to get the steam inside of something so that when you first put the bread in, it releases the steam and gives you that great crust. That's what happens in the enamel pan. So if you don't have that, another option is to put a pan full of water, sometimes ice water they put in there at the bottom, and that creates some steam in the oven. Some people have also just sprinkled water on it. You can try that. So you can try some things, but what you want to do is try to get that crust. And I would just say that if you are going to be making this regularly, just invest in a pot because it's super easy and it just creates the best crust. Okay, so our pot is heated and ready to put the bread in to cook. First though, we have to slash the top. It's very important to slash the top because you'll see it breaks open, and when you slash it, it'll break open where you slashed instead of just puffing out everywhere. So they make a special bread lame to slash with. I don't ever buy anything special, but I do have a very sharp serrated knife which also works for cutting bread, slicing regular bread into slices. And this works very well. The only thing I want to make sure that you know is that you have to cut pretty deep. So you want to cut deep enough to where it will have room to expand. And sometimes people cut really shallow and then it explodes kind of all over. So that's the one tip, is cut pretty deep. So, and also you can slash it any way you want. You can have your own special signature slash. I kind of always do 3 slashes, kind of at the first one centered and the others at an angle, and that's kind of my slash I do all the time. Some people make box. Some people do 2 slashes, make a hashtag, whatever you want to do. You can kind of make it fun. Okay, so after that, we're going to carefully transfer the bread with the parchment into the hot pot. Okay, our bread is done, ready to come out of the oven. I did want to mention that if you have a problem with your bread getting too done on the bottom, if you stick a cookie sheet on a lower rack, that will help if you have issues with that. Okay, so. Oh, this is pretty, look at that. Okay, so we want to put it onto a cooling rack and let it cool. And you'll want to let this cool for at least 30 minutes, preferably an hour or maybe 2 before you cut into it. If you cut into really just baked bread, well, that sounds really great. It makes it very gummy, and so it'll stick to your knife and it won't be as good. Your texture will be better if you let it cool down. If you just can't wait, you could probably take something off the edge and eat that. There you have it. Easy sourdough artisan bread.